So now that we've done our initial introduction to juvenile delinquency, we're going to consider how it's measured and what kinds of general trends these measurements show us. There are three kinds of measurement that are used most often to understand juvenile delinquency. These are the UCR, meaning the Uniform Crime Reports, self-reporting studies, and the NCVS, which is the National Crime Victimization Studies. We'll talk about each one and what they collect, and the value of each set of studies. I'm going to tell you up front that the UCR tends to create a data set that does not collect all the information that one would want to be fully accurate, because many kinds of crimes tend to be underreported. Crimes that are more private in nature, such as domestic violence or crimes regarding sex, these tend to take place in the privacy of the home, and their reporting incidence is much lower than, say, a public crime. Certain crimes tend to be very highly reported, such as auto theft, because it's pretty obvious if your car is stolen, it had to be reported to collect insurance, and because almost all cars are registered and used in public places. So then the hope is that they can be found and recovered. So that kind of crime reporting is very accurate in relation to the number of incidents that take place. Self-reporting studies, when done properly, i.e. assuring confidentiality, and also the NCVS, are believed to be much higher in accuracy than the UCR. But just so you know, the NCVS tends to be used more for assessing trends in adult crime. One shortfall of the NCVS for juvenile studies is that the person reporting the crime doesn't always know the age of the perpetrator. And I'll talk a little bit more about each of these types of studies. The Uniform Crime Reports are collected by the FBI. Every law enforcement agency, whether it is the local city police, the county sheriff, or the state police, is required to send statistics regarding arrests for certain offenses to the FBI. They are only required to send what is known as the Part 1 offenses, which include the more serious felony offenses: murder, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, larceny, which is theft by unlawful taking, auto theft, and arson. For the purpose of understanding how this is relevant to juveniles, these are actually the offenses that would be seen in adult court. Very rarely, if ever, are minor offenses transferred from juvenile to adult court. These figures are collected when they are what is known as cleared by arrest, meaning, of course, that someone has been arrested for the offense. If no one is arrested, the report of this offense is not counted as part of the statistical set. So, as I said earlier, there are some flaws collecting data in this manner. While some crimes are fairly accurate in their reporting, such as high visibility crimes like murder or auto theft, others are not so often reported. The more private the crime, the less accurate the statistics are on it. We know the incidents of domestic violence are much higher than the amount of what is reported. And even when something is reported, the perpetrator is not always arrested. Think in terms of the domestic violence case, where the police are called, but then the couple is referred for counseling instead of an arrest being made. Self-reports yield better data sets that are much more accurate than the UCR. These reports go far beyond the Part 1 offenses that the UCR considers. Remember, the UCR just collects data on the most serious of offenses. Self-reports consider a wide variety of behaviors. When self-reporting is done properly, i.e. assuring confidentiality and subjects are treated appropriately, then the accuracy of the data is much higher than the UCR. It's believed that the data from well-constructed self-reports is much more valid and reliable than any other method used for collecting information about juvenile delinquency. One data set was developed by a researcher named Del Elliott, and he started collecting data back in the 70s. This is called the National Youth Survey. With its long span of information, what is known as a longitudinal study, over a long period of time, we can see that there are some trends regarding changes of the rates of offenses. What self-reporting studies indicate is that law enforcement is not aware of many of the delinquent acts that are occurring. It tells us also that lower-class youth are not the only ones that are committing offenses, that middle-class youth are just as likely to be offenders, but that their offenses are being dealt with differently. We also know that many of these serious offenders are not being apprehended by law enforcement. And we can analyze the data according to race, and when we do that, we begin to realize that black youth, even though the crime rates are the same as their white counterparts, that these black youth are more likely to be arrested, convicted, and institutionalized, meaning taken out of the home and put into a residential program. This phenomenon of black youth being removed from the home is what is called by the justice system as disproportionate minority confinement. It is prevalent not only in the juvenile justice system, but in the adult system as well. It's a very strong concern of the Department of Justice, which is the federal agency that oversees the correction system in the United States. And the last category of data collection methods is what's known as victimization surveys. This data is collected by the Bureau of Justice, a federal agency. They actually partner with the Census Bureau in gathering this data. The Census Bureau has well-trained workers that are responsible for gathering data for not only the census that is collected every 10 years, but a large amount of data about the population in general. So what do census workers do during the 9 years when they are not collecting data for the U.S. Decennial Census? They gather all sorts of other data, including partnering with other federal agencies like the Bureau of Justice. The idea here is that the National Victimization Survey gets to the data using a different methodology than the UCR, and it's used to check the accuracy of the UCR. It's a sampling of a large number of households. I was actually selected by a census worker about 30 years ago to be a respondent and went through the whole process, which from the standpoint of being a subject was very interesting. Confidentiality was very important to assure in the collection of the data. During our interview, we had to be in a room with the doors closed and assurance that no one would overhear our conversation to make sure that I would not feel pressured by anyone to not fully disclose all information related to being a victim. So what does the NVS tell us about juvenile offenders? We know that youth ages 16 to 19 are most likely to be victims, and that adolescents are most likely to be the assailant when the victim knows the perpetrator. And we also know that crimes against youth are less likely to be reported to the police. Let's talk about a couple other trends in juvenile delinquency. We know that there are many more males that come into the juvenile justice system than there are females coming in, and that ratio is over 2 to 1 males to female. Depending on the kind of crime, it may even be higher. For example, the ratio is about 3 to 1 boys to girls for property crimes, and for drugs and violent crimes, the ratio is about 5 to 1 boys to girl. For violent crime, it's even higher, about 5.8 boys to every 1 girl. And there's another trend that I mentioned earlier, and that is DMC. DMC refers to the fact that blacks are historically overrepresented in the justice system. This is true in adult corrections as well, that black youth are overrepresented at over double what they are in the actual population. This issue is considered critical enough that it's what's known as a core requirement mandate by OJJDP, that's the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. What I mean by this is that all states are required to consider DMC in the juvenile justice system and to study the issue and to attempt to resolve it. This federal mandate has been in place since Janet Reno was the Attorney General under President Clinton in the early 1990s. So in order for states to receive federal funds from OJJDP, they have to make efforts to study and resolve DMC. When the states get their pool of money from the federal government, they have a certain amount that is set aside for the DMC effort. The problem is that the issue is very systemic and not something where programs directly affect the outcomes. It's not a difficult issue to study, but it's a very difficult issue to solve. DMC is a systemic issue that now is thought to be due to implicit bias at many different points in the justice system. And that, of course, is why I often assign the implicit association test as an assignment for this course. The juvenile justice system is thought of as a funnel, with youth entering the system at the top, or the widest point of the funnel, and as they go through the system, they drop out of the funnel. The points at which they drop out are the different decision-making processes. At the beginning or at the top of the funnel are all the cases that are reported. Then below that are those that law enforcement decide to arrest. Then what cases might get diverted, meaning no petition to court. Then what plea is bargained out. what goes to trial, some youth are found guilty, some are found innocent, and then those that are probated, meaning they're sent home under community supervision and the terms of probation. At the very bottom of the funnel are those that go to prison, or in the case of juveniles, are sent to residential treatment. So for all the cases where the police receive a complaint or investigate the case, a very, very small proportion of those people are actually locked up. What we do know, though, is that minority youth and youth with low socioeconomic status are much, much more likely to be those that are locked up, that drop through the very middle of the bottom of the funnel.